Lesson 36. In this presentation, we'll be taking a look at the forms of the present passive, and we'll be introduced to the middle voice, to deponent verbs, and to the forms of the future middle. These are the forms of the perfect passive indicative. We're familiar with these by now. Pepao mai, pepao sai, pepao tai. I have been stopped, you have been stopped, he, she, it has been stopped. To get the present passive indicative, first of all, we're going to drop the reduplicated consonant, of course. That leaves us with these. And in between the present stem, pao, and the endings there, mai, sai, tai, etc., we're going to add what are called thematic vowels. These vary between omicron and epsilon depending on the letter that follows. The best thing to do is just think of these not as something separate. You don't even have to remember the term thematic vowel, but as part of the endings, really. So pao, amai. The pao is the present stem, the amai is the passive ending. And that's not all that we have to do. In the second person singular, we're going to have a little bit of a change. Instead of pao esai, which is what we'd expect, we get pao e. That can be spelled epsilon iota or eta with the iota subscript there. And those are the forms of the present passive indicative. These are very common, very useful. They mean things like, I am being stopped, you are being stopped, he, she, or it is being stopped. Very, very useful forms. Now we're going to look at the other moods as well, the imperative and the subjunctive, not the optative quite yet. The imperative forms are unique with the present stem as we would expect, but these new endings, u, esto, este, eston, all of that. So be stopped, let him or her or it be stopped, that sort of thing. For the subjunctive, we're actually going to take our endings from the indicative. We're going to take those whole forms there. And what's going to happen, the only difference between the subjunctive and the indicative is going to be that our thematic vowels, which we just talked about, the omicron and the epsilon, are going to be lengthened in the subjunctive. And there's going to be no change in that second person singular. Anyway, I go through this process of showing you the changes so that you will begin to see patterns in the changes, which will help you to recognize the forms without having to look every single last one up. So, apart from the optative, these are the forms, the full paradigm of the present passive. You see the infinitive there and the participle there as well. Now, the middle voice. The middle voice in Greek has several uses. At its most basic, it shows that the subject of a verb is acting either upon itself or in its own interests. So in active, a verb in the active voice is itself doing the acting, but it's not the thing that it's acting upon. Whereas in the passive voice, the thing isn't really doing the acting at all. It's being acted upon. The middle voice is, as you would expect, right between those two. This acting in one's own interests is a little different, though not unrelated. We'll see in just a second. For example, the following sentences would be expressed in the middle voice in Greek. I'm bathing myself. In English, I'm bathing and I'm bathing myself are basically equivalent in meaning. We can choose to put that reflexive pronoun in there or not. But in Greek, you would use the middle voice if you are the one doing the acting, that is, you're doing the bathing, and if you are the one that you are doing the acting upon, if you're bathing yourself. Also, in a sentence like, the wise guard against temptation, they're the ones doing the guarding, and it's for their own sake that they're doing the guarding. They're not guarding, well, in a sense, they are guarding themselves and guarding in their own interests. The first one, the acting upon themselves, is maybe the better way to think of this particular use of the middle voice. Additionally, some verbs have meanings in the middle that we could not have anticipated. And it's very important to know that there are a lot of these verbs out there. It's good to know the basic principles that help regulate the use of the middle voice. It's also helpful to know that there are verbs out there that we sort of have to learn the meanings of in the middle voice. For instance, pe ta, active voice, I persuade. Pe tamai, middle voice, I heed or even obey, with an object of what you're heeding or obeying in the dative case. Now, this, of course, looks indistinguishable from the passive voice. Its form is going to be indistinguishable in all tenses, as we talked about. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It happens to be identical in form with the passive voice in the present tense. In most tenses, here's where I talk about it, all but the future and aorist, the middle voice is identical in form to the passive. So let's look at another verb. Lu a, I wash or bathe. Lu etai, third person singular, present. Tapai dion. Tapai dion is a little child, a very young child. Because the middle voice and the passive voice are identical in form in most tenses, and this is one of them, the present tense, this could actually mean two different things. It could mean the little child is being bathed. That would be the passive voice. It's not actually doing the acting, it's being acted upon. Or it could mean the little child is bathing. That is itself. That would be the middle voice. So we have to be careful here. What's going to help us? Context, of course. Context will help us tell the middle and the passive apart in these tenses in which their forms are identical. Now we're going to talk about deponent verbs. There's a class of Greek verbs called deponent verbs that have, quote-unquote, laid aside their active forms. That comes from the Latinate word deponent. To depone something, depose is actually related to that, to lay something aside. Despite their being middle/passive in form, these verbs should be translated as active. For instance, makamai, I fight. Regardless of who you're fighting for, who you're fighting with, this is going to look middle/passive in form. Makantai, third person plural, tois polemiois hoiote naioi. So the Athenians are fighting the enemy, fighting with the enemy. Whom you fight with, whom you fight, is put into the dative in Greek. So this is a deponent verb. It's really very active in meaning. The Athenians are doing the fighting, and they're not fighting themselves, obviously. And whether or not they're fighting on their own behalf or not, in their own interests, this is going to be middle passive in form. It's a deponent verb. We do not see it in the active voice. There are lots of these in Greek. The following slide shows the deponent verbs you will see in the readings associated with this grammar presentation. Some common deponent verbs, very common, very useful. Bulamai, I wish. Again, these are all middle passive in form, but active in meaning. Gignamai, I become. Erkamai, I come or go. Elkamai, I pray. Heidamai, I enjoy. Mainamai, I rage. Makamai, I fight. The most important of these would be the first three. Bulamai, gignamai, erkamai. The second and third especially. We see them all the time in Greek. Obviously, important concepts, becoming and coming and going. So note that these will look middle/passive in form, but they will be translated as though they were active in meaning. Now, we're going to look at one of those cases where the forms of the middle are actually different from those of the passive. This is the present middle/passive indicative of this verb, pa'al. So either I am being stopped or I am stopping myself. Either you are being stopped or you are stopping yourself. We're going to form the future middle. And how do we do that? Well, we just insert the sigma, as we've seen in the active voice as well. We just create the future stem, really, by adding the sigma to that present stem, pal. And all the endings are exactly the same. It's actually very easy to form the future in most cases. And this means something like I shall stop myself. Not I shall be stopped. This is not passive, because the future tense is one of the tenses in which the middle voice is actually formed differently than the passive voice. This is unambiguously middle. I shall stop myself. You will stop yourself. He, she, or it will stop itself. For the forms for the present middle passive, take a look at page 64, and for the forms of the future middle, page 66. Thank you very much.